Let me start with something that sounds incredibly simple, but psychologically, it can be one of the most difficult things to do. Stop chasing him. And I don't mean becoming cold. I don't mean playing games. I don't mean pretending you don't care. I mean ending the habit of constantly trying to close the emotional distance between you and an avoidant man. Because here's what happens in the typical dynamic. He pulls away, you feel the distance, and your nervous system interprets that distance as danger. So you reach out, you ask what's wrong, you send another message, you explain yourself, you try to reassure him, you try to remind him how much you care. And when he responds with even more distance, you increase your effort. Now you've created a psychological cycle. He withdraws, you pursue. He feels pressured. He withdraws further. You become more anxious. You pursue harder. And suddenly the relationship isn't being driven by love anymore. It's being driven by regulation. You're trying to regulate your fear of losing him while he's trying to regulate his discomfort with closeness. This is why stopping the chase is so powerful. When you stop pursuing, you aren't necessarily making him miss you through some manipulation technique. You're changing the entire emotional structure of the relationship. For the first time, he has room to experience his own thoughts without your constant presence filling the space. And that's important because you cannot force someone to recognize your value through explanation. Think about that. You can tell someone you're loyal. You can tell them you're different. You can tell them how deeply you care. You can write paragraphs explaining why the relationship matters. But eventually, words become noise if the other person isn't emotionally available to receive them. Sometimes absence communicates what arguments cannot. When you're constantly available, constantly checking in, constantly repairing every moment of distance, he never has to experience the contrast between having access to you and not having access to you. Your presence becomes guaranteed. And human psychology has a complicated relationship with certainty. We often become conscious of the value of something when its availability is no longer automatic. But I want to make one distinction extremely clear. This is not about withholding affection to make him panic. That's manipulation. This is about withdrawing your over-functioning. There's a difference. You stop doing the emotional labor for two people. You stop carrying the entire connection on your back. You stop believing that if you just explain yourself perfectly enough, love him patiently enough, or become understanding enough, you can make another person ready. You can't. And accepting that truth is not weakness. It's emotional maturity. When you step back, something else happens inside you. You begin to reclaim your attention. Instead of waking up wondering, what is he thinking? You start asking, what am I building? Instead of analyzing whether he viewed your message, you start focusing on your own goals. Instead of measuring your worth by his level of affection, you begin measuring your life by your own values. That is where your power returns. And ironically, that shift can also change how he experiences you. He no longer encounters someone desperately trying to secure his attention. He encounters someone who has affection, standards, boundaries, and a life of their own. That's different because genuine attraction isn't sustained by pressure. It's sustained by choice. You want him to choose you, not because you cornered him emotionally, not because you convinced him he couldn't live without you, but because he experienced your presence and recognized its value. And if he doesn't choose you, that answer matters too. Because the purpose of stepping back isn't to guarantee that an avoidant man comes running. The purpose is to discover whether he will. That's the philosophical shift most people miss. You're not stepping back to control his reaction. You're stepping back to reveal his capacity. And once you understand that, you stop fearing silence. You stop treating distance as an emergency. You stop chasing answers from someone who isn't offering them. You become willing to let reality speak. Because sometimes the strongest message you can send isn't another explanation. It's your willingness to stop abandoning yourself for someone else's attention. So remember this, stop chasing the person who is running and start becoming the person you refuse to lose. And once you stop chasing, something even more important has to happen. You have to learn how to remain emotionally calm when he creates distance. Because stopping the chase physically is one thing. Stopping the emotional storm inside your mind is another. You can stop sending messages while spending the next 6 hours wondering why he hasn't replied. You can refuse to call while internally replaying every conversation you've ever had. You can tell yourself you're giving him space while secretly waiting for the notification that proves he still cares. That's not emotional freedom. That's simply anxiety wearing a quieter disguise. Real power begins when you can experience uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to control your behavior. This matters enormously with an avoidant man because emotional intensity can sometimes become part of the very cycle you're trying to escape. He pulls back, you become activated, your emotions become stronger, and then your emotional reaction becomes another reason for him to retreat. So what changes the pattern? Regulation, not suppression, not pretending you don't care. Regulation. There is a profound difference between saying, I don't need him, when you're actually terrified of losing him, and genuinely reaching the place where you can say, I care about him deeply, but I am still okay within myself. That is emotional strength. And emotional strength is attractive because it communicates something deeper than confidence. It communicates stability. Imagine interacting with someone who doesn't punish you every time you need breathing room. Someone who can communicate disappointment without creating chaos. Someone who can say, I would prefer more communication, but I'm not going to lose myself because you're distant. That person feels different. They don't make connection feel like a hostage negotiation. They make connection feel like a choice. And this is where psychology meets philosophy. You cannot control another person's internal world. You cannot command someone to become vulnerable. You cannot force someone to understand your emotional needs at the exact moment you need them understood. But you can control your response. That distinction is the foundation of personal power. When he becomes distant, ask yourself, what story am I creating about this? Because often the event isn't what causes the emotional explosion. It's the interpretation. He hasn't replied. The fact is simple. But your mind might say, he's losing interest. I'm being rejected. Someone else must be more important. I wasn't enough. Now you're no longer responding to reality. You're responding to a story. And stories can create suffering far beyond the facts. So learn to pause, breathe, observe. Don't immediately react. Give yourself enough space to distinguish between what you know and what you're assuming. And then communicate from clarity rather than fear. This doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. Calmness does not mean tolerating disrespect. Emotional regulation should never become an excuse for abandoning your standards. You can be calm and still have boundaries. You can be compassionate and still walk away. You can understand his attachment patterns without making them your responsibility. That's the balance. Because the goal isn't to become emotionally unavailable just because he is. The goal is to become emotionally grounded. And when you become grounded, something remarkable happens. His withdrawal no longer determines your emotional temperature. You stop being pulled into every fluctuation. You become the person who can love without losing yourself, care without chasing, and communicate without collapsing into fear. And that is the foundation for everything that comes next. Because before an avoidant man can experience you as emotionally safe, you must first become emotionally safe for yourself. Master your emotional state, and you stop being controlled by his distance. Now, once you have learned to stop chasing and you have developed the ability to regulate your own emotions, the next question becomes, what do you actually do when he needs space? And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They hear, give him space, and interpret it as disappear completely, punish him with silence, make him jealous, or wait for him to panic. That's not healthy space. That's a power struggle. Real space is different. Real space says, I respect your need to breathe, and I also respect myself enough not to chase you through that door. That distinction is incredibly important because an avoidant man may experience closeness differently from someone who feels naturally comfortable with emotional intimacy. When connection becomes intense, he may instinctively create distance to regain a sense of autonomy. If you respond by pursuing him harder, you unintentionally turn his desire for space into evidence that closeness equals pressure. Now you've reinforced the cycle. He steps back. You move forward. He feels crowded. You demand reassurance. He retreats again. And both people end up believing the other person is the problem. But what if you interrupted the pattern? What if instead of chasing, you allowed the space to exist without turning it into a punishment? You don't send 10 messages asking, what's wrong? You don't manufacture an emergency just to get a response. You don't post something online hoping he'll notice. You don't suddenly become cruel to prove you don't care. You simply continue living. And that is powerful because healthy space allows something that pressure prevents: voluntary movement. If he chooses to come closer, he knows he's doing it because he wants connection, not because he has been emotionally cornered into providing it. And that matters. Love has to contain freedom. If someone can only remain close because you're constantly monitoring, persuading, reassuring, or pursuing them, then what you have isn't emotional security. You have emotional management. And nobody wants to feel managed. But there's another side to this that is even more important. Giving someone space doesn't mean waiting indefinitely. You need standards. You can respect his need for breathing room while still knowing what you require from a relationship. You might think, I understand that you need time, but I also need consistency. I can give you space, but I cannot live permanently inside uncertainty. That's not an ultimatum. That's clarity. You're communicating that his emotions matter, but yours matter too. And this is where mature relationships separate themselves from dysfunctional ones. Maturity says, I don't have to control you to feel secure. But it also says, I don't have to tolerate anything just because I understand you. You can understand why someone withdraws and still decide that their pattern isn't compatible with your life. You can have compassion without becoming their therapist. You can be patient without becoming passive. You can love someone without waiting forever for them to become available. And paradoxically, that combination can make emotional closeness feel safer. When you stop chasing someone every time they step back, you communicate that connection isn't a trap. When you stop punishing them for needing space, you communicate that intimacy doesn't mean losing autonomy. And when you maintain your own standards, you communicate that love doesn't mean self-abandonment. That's the balance. Because ultimately, the goal isn't to make an avoidant man afraid of losing you. The goal is to create a dynamic where both people are free enough to choose each other. So give him room, but don't give away your life. Let him breathe, but keep breathing yourself. Let him choose, but never forget that you are choosing too. Give him space without abandoning yourself. And you'll discover whether he comes closer by choice. And once you learn how to give him space without turning that space into a punishment, you reach the next level of the entire process. You stop trying to prove your worth, because this is where so many people quietly lose themselves. They start thinking, maybe if I become more understanding, he'll finally appreciate me. Maybe if I'm more attractive, more patient, more available, more successful, more affectionate, he'll realize what he has. But notice what is happening. Your entire sense of value has been placed in someone else's hands. And that's a dangerous place to live. You were never supposed to convince another human being that you're worthy of love. Your worth is not something that another person awards you after you perform well enough. That's not love, that's auditioning. And the moment you stop auditioning, the entire energy of the relationship changes. You stop asking, how can I make him choose me? You start asking, does this relationship actually align with the person I'm becoming? That is a much more powerful question, because an avoidant man doesn't need another person constantly demonstrating their value through sacrifice. What he encounters instead is someone who already has a center of gravity. You have your own goals, your own friendships, your own interests, your own standards, your own vision for your future. His attention can add something beautiful to your life, but it doesn't become the foundation of your identity. And that distinction is psychologically significant. When someone senses that your entire emotional stability depends upon their behavior, connection can begin to feel like responsibility. They may feel that every interaction carries enormous emotional consequences. But when you have built a meaningful life of your own, the relationship becomes something different. It's no longer complete me. It's join me. That's a completely different philosophy of love. And here's the irony. When you stop trying so hard to prove your value, people often become more capable of seeing it. Why? Because your value is no longer buried beneath your effort. Think about someone who constantly tells you how trustworthy they are. Eventually, you stop listening to the claim. But someone who consistently behaves with integrity doesn't need to announce it. Their life demonstrates it. The same principle applies here. You don't need to tell him you're independent, live independently. You don't need to announce that you have standards, enforce them. You don't need to convince him you're valuable. Build a life that reflects the value you already believe you possess. And this doesn't mean becoming arrogant. True self-worth is surprisingly quiet. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need constant validation. It doesn't chase someone down demanding, do you see what you're losing? It simply says, I know what I bring, and I know what I will and will not accept. That is confidence without performance. And there's another powerful consequence. When you stop proving yourself, you create room for him to contribute. If you're always initiating, repairing, explaining, planning, reassuring, and carrying the emotional weight, he never has to reveal what he is willing to do. But when you step back, reality becomes visible. Does he reach out? Does he make effort? Does he become more consistent? Does he attempt to understand you? Does he move toward connection? Or does he simply remain distant? You don't have to manufacture the answer. You allow his behavior to provide it. And that is one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself. Because the purpose of self-worth isn't to make an avoidant man obsessed with you. It's to make you unwilling to abandon yourself for anyone. If he rises to meet you, beautiful. If he doesn't, you still win because you didn't lose yourself trying to be chosen. Stop proving you're worthy of love. Live so fully in your worth that the right person recognizes it without being convinced. And once you stop trying to prove your worth, you arrive at another critical truth. Emotional safety is often more powerful than emotional pressure. Now, let's be very clear about what emotional safety means. It does not mean becoming endlessly patient while someone gives you the bare minimum. It doesn't mean tolerating disrespect, accepting inconsistency, or becoming responsible for healing another person's wounds. Emotional safety means creating a relationship environment where honesty doesn't automatically lead to punishment. Vulnerability doesn't immediately become an interrogation, and emotional discomfort doesn't turn into chaos. That's a completely different thing. Because think about what happens when someone feels pressured emotionally. They may hear a simple question like, "What are you feeling?" but internally experience it as, "Explain yourself right now." They may hear, "Where's this relationship going?" and experience it as, "Give me certainty before you're ready." They may hear, "I miss you," and interpret it as, "You are responsible for making me feel secure." The words may be innocent. The emotional pressure behind them may not be. And if an avoidant man already associates intense intimacy with losing autonomy, pressure can activate his instinct to create distance. So what do you do differently? You communicate clearly without demanding an immediate emotional performance. Instead of forcing him to reveal everything, you create room for him to reveal something. Instead of interrogating silence, you can say, "When you're ready to talk, I'm willing to listen." That's powerful because you're not abandoning communication. You're removing coercion from communication. There's a philosophical principle underneath this. You cannot force authenticity. The moment you force someone to open up, whatever they give you may not be genuine openness. It may simply be compliance. Real vulnerability has to contain choice. And this is where emotional safety becomes incredibly important. When someone realizes they can tell you something uncomfortable without being immediately attacked, mocked, criticized, or emotionally punished, the nervous system begins to learn something new. Closeness does not automatically equal danger. That doesn't mean every avoidant man will suddenly transform. People are responsible for their own growth. But your behavior can either intensify a dysfunctional pattern or create conditions in which healthier behavior is possible. And there's another subtle component here, consistency. Emotional safety isn't created by one perfect conversation. It's created through repeated experiences. You say what you mean. You follow through. You don't threaten to leave every time you're frustrated. You don't disappear simply to provoke a reaction. You don't use vulnerability as ammunition later. You don't demand openness from him while refusing to regulate your own emotions. Over time, those patterns communicate something profound. You don't have to constantly defend yourself here. And yet, there's a boundary that must never be forgotten. Safety must be mutual. You are not supposed to become an emotional sanctuary for someone who refuses to provide basic emotional respect in return. You can create a safe environment, but you cannot create a healthy relationship alone. That's why your standards still matter. You can say, "I understand that vulnerability is difficult for you, but communication is important to me." You can say, "I respect your need for space, but disappearing without explanation isn't something I can accept indefinitely." That's not pressure. That's mature communication. You are not demanding that he become someone else. You're communicating the conditions under which you are willing to participate. And when you approach relationships this way, something changes inside you as well. You stop becoming obsessed with getting the perfect response. You stop measuring every conversation by whether he became more affectionate. You start focusing on whether the relationship is becoming healthier. That's a much higher standard because the goal isn't simply to make him feel comfortable. The goal is to create a connection where both people can be honest, autonomous, respected, and emotionally present. And if he responds to that environment by gradually moving closer, you have something worth exploring. If he continues to withdraw indefinitely, you've also received valuable information. Either way, clarity replaces confusion. That's the real power of emotional safety. It doesn't guarantee a particular outcome. It reveals what is actually possible. And remember this, don't pressure someone into vulnerability. Create enough safety for truth to emerge, then let their actions tell you what that truth means. And now we arrive at the point where everything we've discussed becomes real. You've stopped chasing. You've learned to regulate your emotions. You've given space without turning it into punishment. You've stopped trying to prove your worth. You've created room for honest communication without applying emotional pressure. But none of that matters if you are unwilling to enforce your standards. Because ultimately, self-worth isn't demonstrated by what you say. It's demonstrated by what you are willing to walk away from. And this is where many people get trapped. They say, I have boundaries. But a boundary without a consequence is often just a preference. You can tell someone, I need consistency. But if they repeatedly give you inconsistency and you remain indefinitely available, you've communicated something different through your behavior. You've communicated that your boundary is negotiable. Now, that doesn't mean you threaten to leave every time you're disappointed. That's not strength. That's emotional volatility. A genuine boundary is calm. It says, this is what I need in a healthy relationship. If that isn't possible here, I will make a different choice. No shouting, no begging, no dramatic announcement, just clarity. And that kind of clarity is powerful because it changes the psychological dynamic completely. You're no longer trying to control his behavior. You're controlling your participation. That's one of the most important distinctions you can understand in relationships. You cannot make an avoidant man communicate. You cannot make him commit. You cannot make him confront his fears. You cannot make him become emotionally available, but you can decide what you will participate in. That is your territory. And when you operate from that position, something remarkable happens. You stop asking, how do I get him to choose me? You start asking, is what he's offering compatible with the life I want? That's a much stronger question because love should not require you to negotiate against your own dignity. If he needs time, you can respect that. If he struggles with vulnerability, you can have compassion. If he needs autonomy, you can give him room. But compassion does not require self-abandonment. Understanding someone does not mean accepting everything they do. You can understand why someone behaves a certain way and still decide that behavior doesn't work for you. That's emotional maturity. And this is where walking away becomes so powerful, not because you are trying to make him panic, but because you are demonstrating that your love has standards. You're saying, I can love you and still choose myself. That statement contains enormous psychological freedom because now your happiness isn't dependent on whether he comes closer. If he comes closer with genuine effort, you can meet him there. If he doesn't, you don't have to chase him into emotional availability. You can release the outcome. And ironically, that is often when an avoidant man may begin to confront the reality of what he's losing. As long as you're always there, always available, always repairing the distance, he may never fully experience the consequences of his withdrawal. But when you calmly step away from an unhealthy dynamic, reality becomes unavoidable. He has to decide. Not because you've manipulated him, because you've stopped manipulating yourself. And that's the deeper lesson. The purpose of boundaries isn't to make another person behave. The purpose of boundaries is to protect the person you are becoming. Your future self deserves relationships where effort is mutual. Your future self deserves communication that doesn't leave you constantly guessing. Your future self deserves affection that doesn't require you to earn it through endless patience. And your future self deserves peace. So don't make your final standard. Will he come back? Make your standard. If he comes back, what is he bringing with him? Because returning is not the same as changing. Missing you is not the same as being ready for you. Wanting you is not the same as being capable of building with you. Look for behavior. Look for consistency. Look for accountability. Look for emotional courage. Look for actions that match words. That's where the truth lives. And if those things aren't present, you don't need to punish him. You simply choose differently. You walk forward. You continue building. You continue becoming. Because the ultimate victory isn't making an avoidant man melt. The ultimate victory is becoming so secure in yourself that you no longer need anyone else's reaction to know your value. And if he rises to meet you, you can build something extraordinary together. But if he doesn't, you still haven't lost. You chose yourself. Never walk away to make someone chase you. Walk away because your peace is worth protecting. So let me bring all of this together. If there's one thing I want you to understand from this entire conversation, it's that the simple thing that can change everything isn't a manipulation technique, a calculated silence, or some strategy designed to make an avoidant man chase you. It's self-possession. You stop chasing. You regulate your emotions. You give space without abandoning yourself. You stop trying to prove your worth. You create emotional safety without becoming someone's emotional caretaker. And most importantly, you become willing to walk away from what consistently violates your standards. That's the transformation. Because when you stop trying to control his feelings, you finally gain control over your own life. And that's where real attraction, respect, and emotional power begin. You have to understand something. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot communicate perfectly enough to eliminate another person's fears. You cannot sacrifice enough to make someone capable of giving you what they aren't prepared to give. But you can change your side of the equation. You can become calmer. You can become clearer. You can become more independent. You can become more intentional. You can become unwilling to confuse inconsistency with love. And when you do that, you're no longer operating from fear. You're operating from choice. Maybe he notices. Maybe he starts missing you. Maybe he recognizes your value. Maybe he finally understands that your presence was something special. But that's no longer the foundation of your happiness, because you've reached the point where the question isn't, how can I make him stay? The question is, does he have the capacity to meet me where I am? That is a completely different level of consciousness. And if he does, don't demand perfection. Look for progress. Look for accountability. Look for consistency. Look for a willingness to communicate, grow, and participate. And if he doesn't, don't turn his limitations into a verdict about your worth. His inability to receive love does not mean you were unlovable. His fear of intimacy does not mean you were too much. His withdrawal does not mean you weren't enough. Sometimes the lesson isn't that you needed to become more desirable. Sometimes the lesson is that you needed to become more devoted to yourself. So don't become colder. Become stronger. Don't become harder to love. Become harder to manipulate. Don't stop caring. Stop abandoning yourself while you care. And don't walk away hoping he'll chase you. Walk away knowing that your peace, dignity, and future are too valuable to place in the hands of someone who isn't willing to meet you halfway. Because the ultimate goal was never to make an avoidant man melt. The ultimate goal was to become the kind of person who no longer needs to be chosen to know they are valuable. And when you reach that place, something changes. You don't chase love. You attract what is capable of meeting you. You don't beg for consistency. You require it. You don't fear someone's absence. You trust your ability to survive it. And you don't measure your worth by who stays. You measure it by how faithfully you stay connected to yourself. So remember this when you walk away from this speech. The moment you stop abandoning yourself for someone else's love is the moment you become impossible to lose, because you have finally chosen the one person you will have for the rest of your life, yourself.